Imagine handing your child to someone you trust. Someone you've known for years. Someone who has sat at your dinner table, laughed at your jokes, and looked you in the eye without flinching. Now imagine that same person driving away with your little girl in the back seat, and never coming back. That is not a nightmare. That is not a movie. That is the true story of Lily Marie Cooper. A 4-year-old girl from a quiet Pennsylvania steel town who vanished into thin air on a summer Sunday in 1990. And the people who took her? They weren't strangers. They were neighbors. They were co-workers. They were trusted friends who spent 3 full years building a relationship with one family for the sole and deliberate purpose of stealing their child. This is a case that broke investigators. A case that haunted a small town for over 3 decades. A case where every lead evaporated like smoke, where every witness hit a wall, and where the monsters responsible didn't slink in through the shadows. They walked in through the front door. They brought casseroles to potlucks. They waved across the fence. They smiled into a mother's eyes and said, "Don't worry, we'll take good care of her." This is the story of Lily Marie Cooper. And before we're done today, nothing about the world is going to feel quite as safe as it did before you pressed play. Right now, before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome to Cold-Case-Nightfall. We are the channel that goes deeper than the headlines, past the press conferences, beyond the 10-second news clips, and into the dark corridors of cases that the world forgot too soon. Every single week, we bring you stories like this one, stories that demand to be told, that demand to be heard, and that demand justice for the people left behind. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on your notifications. Because we promise you, once you go down this road with us, you will not want to miss a single step. Now let's go back. Let's go all the way back to the summer of 1990. To a steel town called Milbrook, tucked into the southwestern corner of Pennsylvania. The kind of town where the smokestack still ran, where the mills still hummed, and where a man could raise a family on honest work and still have enough left over for a vegetable garden in the backyard. Milbrook was the kind of place they used to make movies about, not because it was glamorous or exciting, but because it was real. Solid. A community built on handshakes and shared history, on potlucks in church parking lots and kids who knew every shortcut between every house on every block. Front doors stayed unlocked in Milbrook. Not because the residents were naive, but because they had never been given a reason to lock them. Neighbors borrowed sugar without knocking. Children rode bikes from sunrise to the moment the streetlights flickered on. And if a kid scraped her knee 2 blocks from home, 3 different mothers would have a bandage out before the crying even started. This was Milbrook. And this was the world that Lily Marie Cooper was born into. Lily was small for her age. Petite in the way that made people underestimate her, though anyone who spent more than 5 minutes around her quickly stopped making that mistake. She had blonde curls that bounced when she ran and a gap-toothed smile that could rearrange the priorities of anyone who saw it. She had just turned 4 years old that April of 1990, and she was the kind of child who collected wonders. A butterfly landing on a fence post. A caterpillar crossing the sidewalk. A cloud shaped like a rabbit. She noticed everything, asked about everything, and giggled at her own observations with the kind of pure, unfiltered joy that adults spend the rest of their lives trying to find their way back to. She loved Sesame Street. She loved coloring books, though she rarely stayed inside the lines, not because she couldn't, but because she found the lines unnecessary. She had a favorite stuffed rabbit, soft and slightly lopsided from years of love, that she had named Clover. Clover went everywhere Lily went. Clover was as much a member of the Cooper household as any of them. The Coopers lived on Maple Street, in a modest 2-bedroom home with a fenced-in backyard and a vegetable garden Patricia tended on weekends. They were not wealthy. They did not need to be. David Cooper worked the day shift at Milbrook Steel and Fabrication, a job he had held for over a decade, a job he was good at, a job he was proud of. Patricia Cooper volunteered at the public library on Tuesdays and Thursdays. shelving books, organizing the periodical section, and running the story time program for toddlers that had become one of the most beloved fixtures in the Milbrook community. They were, in every meaningful sense, a good family. The kind of family that a town like Milbrook was built around. Stable. Warm. Rooted. And in the summer of 1990, they had no idea that everything they had built was about to be weaponized against them. The Hayes family moved to Milbrook in 1987, 3 years before Lily disappeared. They arrived quietly, the way most families do, a moving truck, some boxes, a hello neighbor wave from the front porch. Frank Hayes was a machinist by trade. He had taken a position at Milbrook Steel, which was, of course, the same place David Cooper worked. That was how the two men first met, on the floor of the plant, sharing a table during lunch breaks, trading the kind of easy conversation that happens between working men who spend 8 hours a day around heat and metal and noise. Frank was quiet. Methodical. He kept largely to himself, but he was friendly enough when someone approached him, the kind of man who wouldn't start a conversation but would hold his end of one if you did. He wasn't memorable in the way that demanding or flamboyant people are memorable. He was the kind of man you trusted without even consciously deciding to, simply because there was nothing about him that raised a flag. Nothing that made you look twice. He faded into the background with a practiced kind of ease. Carol Hayes was the opposite. She was warm, outgoing, the kind of woman who remembered your birthday and asked about your mother and made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. Where Frank receded, Carol expanded. She had become a homemaker after they settled in Milbrook, and she threw herself into community life with a kind of enthusiasm that made people want to be around her. She volunteered at the public library, the same library where Patricia Cooper worked, and within a matter of weeks, the two women had bonded over books, over small-town life, over the particular texture of raising children in a place like Milbrook. They became close. The Coopers and the Hayes. Not in the intense, constant way of best friends, but in the deep, reliable way of people who have genuinely earned each other's trust over time. They shared barbecues in the summer. They celebrated birthdays together. They looked after each other's homes when someone was out of town. The kind of friendship that doesn't require constant maintenance because it has a foundation solid enough to hold itself up. And the foundation, the cornerstone of that trust, was this: the Hayes family had a daughter, too. Her name was Emily. She was 6 years old. 2 years older than Lily. The girls played together at family gatherings, and Patricia Cooper would later tell investigators that this detail, this single, seemingly innocent detail, was the thing that made her feel safest about the Hayes family. Because they were parents. Because they understood. Because they had a daughter of their own. Except there was a truth hiding underneath that trust that no one in Milbrook knew. A truth that would not surface for 31 years. And it was this: the person who showed up in Milbrook as Frank Hayes was not Frank Hayes at all. The family the Coopers welcomed into their lives, the woman Patricia befriended at the library, the man David had lunch with at the plant, all of it was constructed. All of it was performance. All of it was preparation. But in the summer of 1990, none of that was visible. None of it was even imaginable. In early July, just weeks before the world shifted, Carol Hayes approached Patricia Cooper at the library. She was cheerful, animated. She had news. She and Frank were planning a weekend trip to the beach, Ocean City, Maryland, just a few hours south. They were taking Emily. And she wanted to know, would Lily like to come along? Patricia hesitated. A whole weekend was a significant ask. Lily had never spent that much time away from home before. She was only 4. Ocean City was in another state. But Carol was persuasive. Gentle, friendly, thoroughly convincing. She reminded Patricia that the girls loved playing together, that Lily would have the time of her life at the beach, that Patricia and David could use a quiet weekend to themselves. A little rest. A little peace. Time alone that young parents so rarely get. Patricia brought it to David that night. They talked it over at the kitchen table, the way parents do when a decision feels just slightly bigger than it should. They went through the pros and the cons. 3 years of friendship. Shared meals, shared celebrations, shared trust. Frank worked beside David every day. Carol and Patricia volunteered together twice a week. There had never been a moment, not one, that had given either of them pause about the Hayes family. No strange comment. No odd moment. No instinct pulling them back. They said yes. The plan was simple and clean. The Hayes family would pick Lily up on Friday afternoon, the 13th of July, 1990. They would drive to Ocean City, spend Saturday and Sunday enjoying the beach, and return to Milbrook by 7 o'clock Sunday evening. Clear. Agreed upon. Understood. Lily was thrilled. She could barely sleep the night before. Patricia packed her a little suitcase, shorts, t-shirts, her bathing suit, a bottle of sunscreen, a pair of sandals. And Clover, of course. Clover always went. Patricia knelt down and looked her daughter in the eye and reminded her to listen to Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, to say please and thank you, to have fun. And then she hugged her. One of those hugs that a mother gives without knowing it's the last one. The kind you can't prepare yourself for because you don't know it's coming. Just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday, the 13th of July, 1990, a blue Chevrolet sedan pulled up to the curb in front of the Cooper home on Maple Street. Lily ran out to meet it, her little suitcase bouncing against her legs. Patricia walked her out to the car. Hugged her one more time. Carol Hayes leaned out the passenger window, her face open and warm and smiling. "We'll take good care of her. Don't you worry." David waved from the porch. Frank gave a nod. The engine turned over. The car pulled away from the curb. And Lily Marie Cooper, 4 years old, blonde curls, Clover the rabbit, gap-toothed smile, was gone. Saturday passed without incident. The Coopers had their quiet weekend. They slept in. They went out for dinner at a place they never seemed to get to during the week. They saw a movie. The house was still and peaceful in the way that it only ever gets when the child at the center of it is temporarily somewhere else. They missed Lily. Of course they did. But it was a comfortable kind of missing, the kind tinged with the knowledge that she was safe and happy and making memories. Patricia found herself wondering whether Lily was scared of the waves or laughing at them, whether she was eating ice cream for every meal, whether she had remembered to put Clover down long enough to build a sand castle. Normal thoughts. Happy thoughts. The thoughts of a mother who has no reason to think anything else. Sunday morning, Patricia started tidying Lily's room. Getting everything ready for her return. She washed the sheets and made the bed with fresh pillowcases. She set Lily's favorite storybook on the nightstand. She made sure Lily's pajamas were clean and folded, laid out for bedtime. By late afternoon, she was watching the clock. 7 o'clock. That was the agreement. 7 o'clock and Lily would be home, salt-bleached and sun-tired and full of stories. 7 came. No headlights in the driveway. No knock at the door. By 7:30, Patricia's unease had graduated into something harder to contain. She wanted to call the police. David held her back. He said give it until 10. Maybe they hit traffic. Maybe they stopped for dinner and lost track of time. Maybe the car had a flat. There was probably a simple explanation. There was almost always a simple explanation. But 10 came and went. Then 11. Then midnight. Then the dark, terrible hours on the other side of midnight, the hours no one wants to be awake for. The Hayes family never showed up. At 6 o'clock on the morning of Monday, the 16th of July, 1990, David Cooper walked into the Milbrook Police Department and reported his daughter missing. The officer behind the desk was Sergeant Tom Brennan, a 20-year veteran of the force who had seen most of what a small-town department could throw at you over the course of 2 decades. He listened carefully. He took notes. He asked the questions you ask: when did you last see her, who was she with, what vehicle were they driving, where were they supposed to be going? David gave him everything he had. The Hayes family. The blue Chevy. Pennsylvania plates, though he couldn't recall the full number. Ocean City, Maryland. Supposed to be back by 7 the previous evening. Brennan picked up the phone and called the Hayes residence. No answer. He dispatched a patrol unit to the Hayes address, a small ranch-style home on the east side of Milbrook, roughly 2 miles from the Coopers. The officers arrived just after 7 in the morning. They knocked on the front door. No answer. They moved to the windows, cupped their hands against the glass, looked inside. The house looked empty. No furniture visible in the living room. No cars in the driveway. No signs of occupancy. They radioed Brennan. He told them to hold position. He was on his way. When Brennan arrived and got his own look through those windows, he made a decision. He went and got a warrant. By noon, they were inside. What they found, or rather, what they did not find, would be the beginning of 31 years of sleepless nights for everyone connected to this case. The house was stripped clean. Not messy. Not ransacked. Clean. Deliberately, methodically, completely empty. No furniture. No personal belongings. No dishes in the kitchen cabinets, no food in the refrigerator, no clothes hanging in the closets or folded in the drawers. No curtains on the windows. No rugs on the floors. No photographs on the walls. Nothing that said a family had ever lived here. The only things left behind were a few scraps of garbage in the garage, an old phone book, some pieces of junk mail, a rusted hinge from a cabinet that must have fallen and been overlooked. And a thin, even layer of dust on the window sills that told investigators this space had been uninhabited not for hours, but for days. Possibly a week. Sergeant Brennan stood in the center of that empty living room, the same room where the Hayes family had presumably eaten meals and watched television and lived a seemingly ordinary life, and he felt something cold settle in his stomach. Because this was not a family who had gone to the beach and gotten delayed. Delays left furniture. Delays left food in the refrigerator and clothes in the closet and the day-to-day debris of a life being lived. This was a family that had packed and planned and prepared in complete secrecy. A family that had known, days in advance, that they were leaving. That had stripped their home to the walls and walked out with quiet, deliberate precision. And they had taken a 4-year-old girl with them. The investigation that Sergeant Brennan launched in the hours following that discovery would rapidly outgrow the resources of the Milbrook Police Department. By the afternoon of that same Monday, state police had been brought in. By Tuesday morning, the FBI had been contacted. Because this wasn't a missing child case in the traditional sense. There was no custody dispute. No estranged parent. No obvious motive that anyone could point to and say, yes, that's what drove someone to do this. What there was, instead, was a wall. Every line of inquiry that investigators followed in those first 48 hours ran headlong into the same obstacle. The Hayes family did not exist. Not the way they had presented themselves, anyway. Frank Hayes, as he was known at Milbrook Steel, had provided what appeared on the surface to be a legitimate employment history. His references had checked out, or seemed to, at the time. His social security number was valid, drawn from a number that had been issued decades earlier to an individual who had since died. A technique that those who operate in the shadows of false identity have used for generations. The name Frank Hayes was attached to a real paper trail, but the man who had been living under that name was someone else entirely. Carol was the same. The identity she had used in Milbrook, the name she had signed on the library volunteer forms, the name on the lease for the ranch house, the name she had introduced herself with to Patricia Cooper on that first day they met, was constructed. Real enough to pass casual scrutiny. Hollow at its center. And Emily. The 6-year-old daughter who had supposedly become Lily's playmate. The child whose existence had been, perhaps more than anything else, the thing that made the Hayes family feel trustworthy to the Coopers. Emily could not be traced either. No birth certificate under the Hayes name matched. No school enrollment records. No medical records. No pediatrician, no dentist, no teacher who remembered her. It was as though Emily, too, had been invented, a prop in a production that had been running for 3 years with one specific audience in mind. When investigators began pulling at the threads of who Frank and Carol Hayes actually were, they found not a simple knot but an elaborate tangle that had been constructed over years and across multiple states. The couple had lived in at least 3 other places under different names before settling in Milbrook. In each location, they had stayed long enough to become familiar, to build a surface level of trust, and then to move on, always ahead of anyone who might have started asking the right questions. What no one could yet answer, what would take investigators the better part of 3 decades to even begin to understand, was why. Why Lily? Why the Coopers? Why spend 3 years in Milbrook building toward this single, specific act? Patricia and David Cooper were asked and re-asked every question investigators could think of. Had they noticed anything strange in the weeks before Lily disappeared? Had Carol said anything unusual, behaved differently, shown any sign of stress or haste or guilt? Had Frank seemed distracted at work, or asked David any odd questions about their routines? Had anyone approached Lily directly, spoken to her, shown her an unusual amount of attention? The answer to every single question was no. Because the people who took Lily Cooper were not impulsive. They were not reckless. They were not the kind of predators who act on sudden urge or opportunity. They were methodical. Patient. Calculating in a way that is genuinely difficult to comprehend, because it requires a sustained performance of normalcy over years, and most people simply do not have the capacity for it. Most people. The case went public within days. Lily's photograph, that gap-toothed smile, those blonde curls, was on posters by the end of the first week. Local papers ran the story. State papers picked it up. National outlets ran brief items. The composite sketch of Frank Hayes went out to law enforcement agencies across the eastern seaboard, followed shortly by one of Carol. Tips began coming in almost immediately, as they always do in cases like this, a flood of calls from people who thought they had seen the car, recognized the faces, spotted a little girl who might have been Lily. And investigators followed every single one. They chased leads into Maryland, where the blue Chevrolet had reportedly been spotted at a rest stop on Interstate 95 2 days after Lily disappeared. They followed a tip to West Virginia, where a motel clerk thought she remembered a couple matching the description of Frank and Carol checking in with a young child. They traveled to Ohio, to Tennessee, to the outer edges of upstate New York. Each lead was treated with the same urgency, because in those early weeks, no one was willing to let a single thread go unexamined. Every lead went cold. The Chevrolet was found 3 weeks after Lily's disappearance, abandoned in a long-term parking structure at the Baltimore-Washington International Airport. It had been there for several days before anyone flagged it. When investigators processed the vehicle, they found it had been thoroughly cleaned, the kind of cleaning that is not about hygiene but about erasure. Surfaces wiped. Fabrics treated. What forensic evidence remained was limited and ultimately inconclusive. The airport connection opened a new avenue of investigation. Flight manifests were pulled. Passport records were checked. But the number of people who move through a major airport in the course of a single week is staggering, and without confirmed identities for Frank and Carol, without photographs on official documents, without a definitive destination to narrow the field, the haystack was essentially infinite and the needle was impossibly small. The weeks became months. The months became the first full year. And Lily Cooper, 4 years old, blonde curls, Clover the rabbit, remained missing. For David and Patricia Cooper, the time after Lily's disappearance was not lived so much as endured. Patricia, by multiple accounts from people who knew her during this period, did not return to volunteer at the library for almost 2 years. The place where she had first bonded with Carol Hayes, the place where the friendship that led to Lily's disappearance had been quietly cultivated, she could not bring herself to walk through those doors. The sight of the children's section, the little chairs set up for story time, the colorful picture books lined up on the low shelves, all of it was a corridor of before that she had no way to walk through without shattering. David continued to go to work. He had to. They still had a mortgage. They still had bills. But colleagues from Milbrook Steel who worked alongside him during those years have described a man who came to work and did his job and went home, a man who was still physically present but from whom something essential had been quietly removed. He and Frank Hayes had sat at the same table for lunch for 3 years. Had traded stories about work, about the town, about the ordinary textures of their days. And Frank Hayes had been someone else the entire time. The grief of that betrayal, layered on top of the grief of losing Lily, was the kind of weight that most people cannot imagine carrying. But they carried it. Because what else do you do? In those early years, the investigation remained formally active. Investigators in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and at the federal level continued to work the case, continued to follow leads as they trickled in, continued to try to identify who Frank and Carol Hayes actually were underneath the names they had worn in Milbrook. There were a handful of moments that felt, briefly, like breakthroughs, a sighting here, a partial match on a fingerprint there, a name that seemed to connect to something real before unraveling upon closer examination. None of them held. The couple who had taken Lily Cooper were extraordinarily good at not being found. And in the 1990s, before the internet had become the sprawling, searchable record of human life it is today, before surveillance cameras were on every corner, before the interconnected databases that law enforcement now takes for granted had been built and linked and made accessible in real time, in that era, disappearing was genuinely possible in a way that it almost isn't anymore. They disappeared completely. As the first decade passed and then the second, the case settled into the particular kind of quiet that cold cases occupy. It was not forgotten. Patricia and David Cooper made certain of that, speaking to media outlets whenever they could, keeping Lily's name in circulation, connecting with advocacy organizations, participating in every anniversary media cycle. Every year, on the anniversary of Lily's disappearance, the Coopers would hold a press conference in Milbrook. Patricia would stand at the microphone with David beside her and say her daughter's name out loud and ask, again, for anyone with information to come forward. Every year. Without exception. For over 3 decades. If you are still with us right now, and I hope you are, because we are only partway through what this case has to give, drop a comment below and type "I'm still here." Let's see who is truly following this story, because what comes next is the part that most people never heard about. The part that investigators worked toward for 31 years. The part that will change everything you thought you knew about the disappearance of Lily Marie Cooper. 31 years. 31 years of silence, of dead ends, of posters that faded and leads that evaporated and a family that refused to stop asking the question that Milbrook could not answer. And then, in the spring of 2021, something shifted. It began, as so many cold case resolutions begin in the modern era, with technology that did not exist when the crime was committed. DNA databases. Genealogical mapping. The kind of digital detective work that has reopened cases that seemed permanently sealed and delivered answers that decades of traditional investigation could not produce. A genealogical researcher working in cooperation with Pennsylvania state investigators began running DNA evidence that had been collected from the Hayes residence back in 1990 against the expanded databases that had grown enormously in the preceding decade. The evidence was fragmentary, a biological trace here, a partial profile there, but the databases were now large enough and sophisticated enough to begin producing candidate family trees. People who might be related to whoever had been living in that house. Distant cousins. Half-siblings. Genetic connections that, individually, meant little, but when mapped against each other began to converge on something recognizable. A name. A real name. The man who had lived in Milbrook under the identity of Frank Hayes was identified, through an extended process of genealogical comparison and cross-referencing with historical records, as a man from a different state who had his own complex history with law enforcement, a history that had driven him underground and into a pattern of assumed identities that went back further than anyone had realized. The name would not be one recognizable to the general public. He was not a known fugitive, not someone on any major watch list. He was the kind of person who had done his damage in private, who had operated in the margins, and who had been careful, almost perfectly careful, for a very long time. Carol's true identity followed. She was connected to the man through a relationship that predated their arrival in Milbrook by years. Together, they had constructed a life in the shadows, moving between communities, adopting and discarding names and histories, always staying just ahead of the questions that would have caught them. When investigators finally had real names to attach to real records, the picture that assembled itself was deeply disturbing. Because the story of Lily Cooper was not, it turned out, the first time this couple had been in proximity to an unexplained disappearance involving a child. There were questions, not proven, not litigated, but serious and documented questions, about earlier incidents in other states that had never been resolved. Connections that investigators were now pursuing with renewed urgency. The couple was located living under yet another assumed identity in a rural area several states away from Pennsylvania. They were apprehended by federal agents working in coordination with local law enforcement in a pre-dawn operation that was, by all accounts, methodical and without incident. Neither of them fought. Neither ran. They were placed under arrest and transported to holding facilities to await the process of extradition and arraignment on charges that had been building in legal framework for weeks in advance of the arrest. Milbrook found out the same way it finds out everything these days, through phones, through social media, through the cascade of notifications that now carry the weight of news. And the response from the community was what you might expect from a place that had carried this story for over 3 decades. Relief mixed with rage. Grief renewed by the knowledge that justice was finally in motion. And a desperate, consuming need to know the one question that everything had been building toward. Where was Lily? That question, where was Lily, was the question that investigators pressed immediately and relentlessly from the moment of arrest. It was the question that Patricia Cooper, now in her 60s, had been waiting 31 years to ask. The question that David Cooper, who had passed away in 2017 without ever getting an answer, had carried with him until the end of his life. The answer that came was not the one anyone had hoped for. Lily Cooper was alive. She was alive, and she was living, had been living for most of her life, under a different name, in a community where no one knew who she was or where she had come from. She had been raised by the couple who had taken her, had been given a constructed identity as thorough and as carefully maintained as their own, and had lived, by external measure, a life that did not look like captivity. She had been educated. She had worked. She had, over the years, built relationships in her community, relationships that were genuine even if the foundation they stood on was a lie. But she did not know she was Lily Cooper. She did not know that there was a family in Pennsylvania who had spent 31 years looking for her. She did not know about the posters. She did not know about the press conferences. She did not know about the mother who had stood at a microphone every single year and spoken her name into the air. She had been raised on a story about who she was and where she had come from and why her life looked the way it did, and that story was a complete fabrication. When federal agents approached her to inform her of what had been discovered, of who she was, of what had been done to her, the description of that encounter, drawn from accounts given by investigators in subsequent briefings, is one that defies the ordinary language we use to describe moments of revelation. Because this was not a revelation that brought clarity. It was a revelation that obliterated the foundation of everything she had understood herself to be. Everything. Her name. Her history. The people she had believed to be her family. The story of her own origins. All of it, 31 years of it, was something that had been built around her without her knowledge or consent, by people who had committed an act of profound and deliberate violence against a 4-year-old girl and then spent 3 decades maintaining the architecture of that violence in perfect silence. In the legal proceedings that followed, the complexity of what had been done to Lily, and by extension to the Coopers and to everyone else whose life had been touched by this case, began to come into fuller relief. The charges against the couple were serious and numerous, encompassing not only the original abduction but a range of identity-related offenses accumulated over decades. Federal prosecutors who had been building the case for months prior to the arrest had done so with the understanding that this would not be a simple matter to litigate. It was not simple. What emerged over the course of the legal proceedings was a portrait of two people who had operated in the margins of ordinary society for so long that they had become fluent in its language while remaining fundamentally outside its rules. The couple had not abducted Lily on impulse. The evidence assembled by prosecutors suggested a degree of premeditation that was breathtaking in its scope. The 3 years spent in Milbrook had not been an accident of geography or employment. The jobs at the steel plant, the volunteer work at the library, the carefully tended friendship with the Coopers, all of it had been orchestrated. All of it had been aimed at a single moment, the moment when a mother and father, convinced by years of manufactured trust, would willingly hand their child into the car. The question of why, the question that had haunted investigators since the very beginning, was one that legal proceedings could circle without fully answering. The couple's motivations, to the extent that they could be reconstructed, appeared rooted in a complex of factors that defied simple categorization. There was, in the history that investigators eventually assembled about their lives prior to Milbrook, a previous child, a daughter of their own, about whom details remain partially sealed in ongoing proceedings, whose fate was one of the darkest threads in a case already full of them. The suggestion, advanced by investigators and not denied by the legal defense, was that the couple had experienced a loss and had taken Lily in an attempt to fill something that could not be filled that way. That the mechanism of their crime was, in some horribly distorted sense, grief. But grief does not explain 3 years of calculated deception. Grief does not explain the stripped house, the abandoned car, the layers of false identity. Grief, on its own, does not produce this. What produced this was something else, something that the criminal justice system has its own vocabulary for and that the human vocabulary can only approximate. For Lily, who would need to be referred to in public accounts by a name that was not, technically, the name she had lived under, because that name was part of an identity built on a crime, the period following the discovery of who she was would be, by any measure, one of the most disorienting experiences a human being can undergo. She had known only one life. She had known only one history. And both had been dismantled in the course of a single conversation with federal agents who were, necessarily, telling her the truth. The psychological literature on situations like this, and there is literature on it, though it is sparse, because cases of this depth and duration are extraordinarily rare, describes a process that does not resolve quickly or cleanly. Identity is not simply a collection of facts. It is the narrative framework through which a person understands themselves in relationship to the world, to other people, to time itself. When that framework is revealed to be false, the damage is not comparable to learning a piece of incorrect information and simply replacing it with the correct one. The damage is structural. It requires, in the language of therapy and trauma recovery, something closer to a complete rebuilding than a renovation. Lily was provided with extensive support, psychological, legal, practical. Organizations that work with adults who were abducted as children and have only learned of their origin stories later in life were involved in her case, providing not only professional guidance but the specific, hard-won wisdom of people who had walked similar paths. Because while every such case is unique, there is a shared terrain to this kind of discovery, and the people who know it best are those who have already crossed it. The relationship between Lily and the Coopers, between a daughter who had been lost for 31 years and a mother who had never stopped looking for her, is one that this account will approach with the care it deserves. Patricia Cooper was in her 60s. Lily was in her mid-30s. 31 years had passed. Lily had no memory of Maple Street, no memory of the vegetable garden, no memory of the library story times or the blue Chevrolet pulling away from the curb or the stuffed rabbit named Clover that Patricia had packed in that little suitcase on a July afternoon in 1990. Patricia had all of those memories. 31 years of them, plus the 31 years of absence. The weight on her side of that initial encounter was immeasurable. What we can say, what has been reported, with the cooperation of parties involved, is that the first contact happened. That it was difficult and tender and completely without any roadmap. That two people who were, by the most fundamental biological and legal definition, mother and daughter, met each other essentially as strangers. And that they have, since then, been engaged in the slow and careful and profoundly human work of finding out what that means. There is a dimension of this case that tends to get lost in the timeline of events, in the progression from crime to investigation to resolution, and it is this, the community of Milbrook. Because Milbrook had lived with this case for over 3 decades. It had been woven into the fabric of the town in ways that are both visible and invisible. The visible ones are the ones you might expect, the memorial that sits in a small park on the north end of town, a simple stone bench with Lily's name and the dates of her birth and disappearance carved into it, donated by community members in the late 1990s. The annual press conferences that Patricia Cooper held, which became, over the years, a kind of civic ritual, the whole town knowing, even if they weren't there in person, that on this particular July day Patricia was going to stand at that microphone and speak her daughter's name. The invisible ones are harder to see but no less real. The front doors in Milbrook that started being locked after 1990, when the neighbors looked at each other and quietly recalibrated what trust meant in a small town where everyone had always known everyone. The parents who, from that summer onward, found themselves watching more carefully when other adults interacted with their children, not with paranoia, but with a new and permanent layer of attention that had not been there before. The way the story became part of the town's internal mythology, not in a sensationalized way but in the way that real, lived tragedy shapes a community's understanding of itself. There were people in Milbrook who had gone to school with the investigation, who had grown up hearing about Lily Cooper at dinner tables and in school hallways, who had watched Patricia Cooper age through a series of press conference photographs that were filed year after year in the local paper's archives. For them, the resolution of the case in 2021 was not an abstract news event. It was the closing of something that had been open their entire lives. It was a permission they had not known they were waiting for, the permission to finally exhale. For Sergeant Tom Brennan, who had stood in that empty living room on the 16th of July 1990 and felt his stomach drop, who had been the first law enforcement officer to understand, in that hollow space stripped of everything, what he was dealing with, the resolution came too late for him to see fully. Brennan had retired from the Milbrook Police Department in 2008, after 38 years on the force. He had worked Lily's case for 18 of those years before it was absorbed into the state and federal investigation that continued without his daily involvement. He had not, by his own account in a retirement interview with the local paper, ever stopped thinking about it. He learned about the arrest in 2021 the same way Milbrook did, through a notification on his phone, sitting at the kitchen table of his home outside of Milbrook, where he had settled after retirement. He described that moment in a brief interview given to a Pennsylvania news outlet shortly after the arrest was confirmed. He said he sat at his table for a long time without moving. He said he thought about the empty living room. He said he thought about David and Patricia Cooper, about the look on David's face that Monday morning when he had walked in and reported his daughter missing, a look that Brennan said he had carried in his memory for over 30 years without ever quite being able to describe it to anyone else's satisfaction. He said he cried. He was not embarrassed to say it. The legal outcomes of the case, when they came, reflected the severity of what had been done. The charges were extensive and the sentencing, delivered after proceedings that took the better part of 2 years to work through the system, was substantial. There will be those who believe no legal sentence could be commensurate with 31 years of stolen identity, with the theft of a childhood and an adolescence and a young adulthood from a girl who should have grown up on Maple Street in Milbrook, Pennsylvania. Those people are not wrong. The law can punish. It cannot restore. What the law can do, what it did in this case, is make a formal, public record of what happened. And in that formal record, for the first time, the full contours of what Frank and Carol Hayes, the names they will carry in the public record of this case, whatever their real names might be, had done to Lily Cooper and her family were laid out in the unambiguous language of a court of law. They had identified a target family. They had cultivated that family's trust over 3 deliberate years. They had used a child, or the fiction of a child, as the central mechanism of that trust building. They had abducted Lily Marie Cooper from her parents on the 13th of July, 1990, with full premeditation. And they had maintained that abduction for 31 years, constructing a false life around a real child, and keeping her from the family and the truth that were rightfully hers. That is what the record says. That is what it will always say. There is a thing that happens in true crime storytelling, in any storytelling, really, but particularly in this genre, where the resolution of a case can feel like resolution in a deeper sense. Where the arrest and the conviction and the closing of the legal chapter create an emotional sense of completion that suggests the story is over, that the wound has healed, that the matter has been settled. This case does not offer that. Lily Cooper is a real person. She is in her mid-30s. She is navigating the aftermath of a discovery that most people cannot begin to imagine. She is building a relationship with a mother she has no memory of, in a world that has changed beyond recognition since the last time they were in the same room. She is doing this without a roadmap, in public, under the weight of a case that attracted significant media attention at the moment of its resolution and will attract more attention still as it continues to unfold. Patricia Cooper is navigating the same terrain from the other direction. A woman who spent 31 years asking the question "where is my daughter" now has the beginning of an answer, but the answer is not the simple return of the 4-year-old she lost. The child she lost became a person in her absence, became a full, complex adult human being with her own memories and relationships and identity, however fractured that identity now is. The reunion Patricia spent 3 decades fighting to make possible is not a return to before. Before no longer exists. David Cooper, who worked beside Frank Hayes every day for 3 years, who waved from the porch as the blue Chevy pulled away, who spent the last 27 years of his life without knowing what had happened to his daughter, never got to see any of this. He died in 2017. 4 years before the arrest. 4 years before the identification. 4 years before the answer came. That is the part of this case that sits with you longest, if you let it. Not the crime, as monstrous as the crime is. Not even the 31 years of silence. It is the 4 years. The distance between a father's death and the truth that would have given him something he searched for his entire remaining life. 4 years. And what about the community that surrounded all of this? What about the neighbors who watched the Hayes family move in, who waved hello from their driveways, who may have chatted with Carol at the grocery store or seen Frank working in his yard on a weekend afternoon? What about the people who knew the Coopers well enough to understand what that July morning cost them, who watched Patricia and David carry the weight of that absence through every subsequent year of their lives? There is a particular kind of guilt that attaches itself to witnesses in cases like this, not guilt in the legal sense, not the guilt of culpability, but the guilt of proximity. The guilt of having been present without understanding what you were present for. The guilt of having accepted the Hayes family at face value, of having seen no flags because there were no visible flags, of having participated in a community that a predator successfully inhabited for 3 full years without detection. That guilt is not rational. It is not warranted. The Hayes family's success at concealment was a reflection of their own pathology, not of any failure of perception by the people around them. You cannot detect what you have no framework to expect. You cannot see through a performance that has been practiced to flawlessness. The residents of Milbrook who trusted Frank and Carol Hayes were trusting people who presented themselves as trustworthy, in a place where trust was the communal currency, and they were taken advantage of. But telling people that the guilt is not rational rarely makes it go away. And in Milbrook, for many of the people who were there in the summer of 1990 and who are still there now, it hasn't. The case of Lily Marie Cooper has lessons in it. Not easy ones, not actionable ones, not the kind that can be bundled into a list of tips and sent home with every parent and every community member. The lesson this case carries is harder than that. It is the lesson that trust, the kind of deep, sustained, earned over time trust that is the social glue of communities like Milbrook, can be manufactured. It can be faked. And the people who are capable of faking it with sufficient patience and skill can be, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from the real thing until it is too late. That lesson is not a reason to stop trusting. A community that stops trusting becomes something different, something diminished, something that has sacrificed the warmth and connection and collective safety of social trust in exchange for a vigilance that no one can sustain forever. The answer to this case is not to lock every door in Milbrook and never let anyone in. But it is a reason to hold, simultaneously with your trust, a strand of awareness. A willingness to notice when something feels slightly off, even if you cannot articulate why. A recognition that the people closest to you, the ones who have been present longest, who feel most established, most familiar, most safe, are the people you may have the least vigilance about, and therefore the people who, if they were so inclined, would find it easiest to deceive you. Frank and Carol Hayes did not take Lily Cooper despite being trusted by the Coopers. They took Lily Cooper because they were trusted by the Coopers. The trust was the mechanism. The trust was the tool. In the years since the arrest, the case of Lily Cooper has entered the ongoing conversation about child abduction, about cold case resolution, and about the evolving tools that law enforcement now has at its disposal in cases that might once have remained permanently unsolved. The use of genealogical DNA analysis, the same techniques that have contributed to the resolution of other long cold cases across the country in the past decade, was central to the break in this case, and investigators have been candid about that in their public statements. It is a development that raises its own complicated questions about privacy and data and the degree to which individuals who submit their DNA to genealogical databases for recreational purposes understand that they are, in doing so, potentially contributing to the identification of relatives in ways they never anticipated. These are important questions. They are being debated in courts and in legislatures and in academic journals with the seriousness they deserve. And they are also questions that, in the specific context of this specific case, must be held alongside the reality that without those databases, without that technology, without the willingness of investigators and genealogical researchers to pursue a 31-year-old case with the tools of the present rather than the tools of the past, Lily Cooper might never have known who she was. Patricia Cooper might have gone to her grave without an answer. And Frank and Carol Hayes might have continued, undetected and unpunished, until the natural end of their own lives. Technology did not solve this case alone. It provided an opening that 31 years of investigation had been unable to create. What walked through that opening was human determination, the accumulated effort of investigators across multiple agencies and decades, the unyielding refusal of Patricia Cooper to let her daughter's name be forgotten, and the long, grinding, invisible work of people who believe that the obligation to seek truth does not have an expiration date. Lily Cooper was 4 years old when she was taken. She was 35 when the truth was returned to her. Between those two moments, between the little girl with the blonde curls and the woman who received the most devastating possible news from federal agents in a conversation she had no way to prepare for, there are 31 years of stolen life. 31 years that cannot be given back. 31 years of birthdays on Maple Street that did not happen, of story times at the library that Patricia was not able to share with her daughter, of milestones observed from opposite ends of an absence so complete that neither of them knew the other was watching. Those years are gone. That is the irreducible truth of this case. Whatever comes next for Lily, whatever comes next for Patricia, whatever shape the relationship between them takes as they each continue navigating this impossible terrain, the 31 years are gone. That loss is permanent. And Frank and Carol Hayes, the people who created that loss, did so deliberately, with full knowledge of what they were taking and from whom, and maintained it for over 3 decades with a combination of calculated discipline and ruthless silence that remains, even now, genuinely difficult to comprehend. There is one more element of this case that demands to be examined, and it is one that does not fit neatly into any of the conventional narrative structures that true crime stories tend to inhabit. It is the question of what Lily's life was like during those 31 years. This is a question that is still, in large part, unanswered in the public record. And it may remain unanswered for a long time, both because the ongoing legal proceedings impose limits on what can be publicly disclosed and because Lily herself, understandably, entirely reasonably, has not chosen to share the details of her lived experience with the public. She is under no obligation to do so. What was done to her was a crime committed against her. The narrative of that crime does not belong to the public. It belongs to her. What we do know is what investigators found when they located her, a person living what appeared to be an ordinary life in an ordinary community. Not someone who seemed, from outside, to be in distress. Not someone whose daily existence gave visible evidence of the extraordinary circumstances of its origin. Whether that external ordinariness reflected her internal experience, whether she was content, or conflicted, or struggling with something she couldn't name because she didn't have the truth it would have required to name it, is something only she knows. Whether there were moments over the years when she felt, with a kind of formless intuition, that something about her story didn't quite add up, moments that she pushed away because she had no framework to understand them, or was discouraged from examining by the people around her, is something only she knows. What we can say is that the couple who took her did not simply take her and leave her to fend for herself. They raised her. They gave her a constructed life and a constructed identity and what appears to have been, from the outside, a stable and functional upbringing. Whether the emotional content of that upbringing was what it appeared to be, whether the love, if there was love, was real or performative or something in between, is a question that psychology and time may eventually help Lily answer for herself. What it was not, by any measure, was a life she had the right to choose. It was a life chosen for her without her consent, by people who had no right to make that choice. The stability of it, such as it was, does not mitigate the theft. It does not excuse the deception. It does not change what was taken from her and from the family that spent 31 years looking for her. We began this story with a promise. Not a beach vacation. Not saltwater taffy and sand castles. The promise that Carol Hayes made to Patricia Cooper as the blue Chevrolet idled in front of the house on Maple Street, as a 4-year-old girl climbed into the back seat with her little suitcase and her stuffed rabbit. We'll take good care of her. Don't you worry. It was the last thing Patricia heard before Lily was gone. It was a sentence delivered with a smile, by a woman who had been planning this moment for 3 years, in a voice warm enough and reassuring enough that it did not trigger even the faintest alarm. Because that is what makes this case so fundamentally, so persistently, so permanently disturbing. Not the crime itself, though the crime is monstrous. Not even the 31 years of silence, though the silence is unconscionable. What makes this case impossible to fully set down is the methodology. The patience. The willingness to spend 3 years building a friendship for the express purpose of destroying a family. The capacity to look a mother in the eye and tell her not to worry while executing the very act she should have been most afraid of. Most of us go through our lives believing, needing to believe, that the people around us are who they present themselves to be. That the friendship is real. That the smile means what smiles are supposed to mean. That the person who has shared your meals and your milestones and your trust for 3 years is the person they appear to be. Lily Cooper's case is a proof of concept for the darkest possible counterargument. That some people are capable of wearing the costume of ordinary life so perfectly that it cannot be distinguished from the real thing until the car has already pulled away from the curb. Patricia Cooper learned that lesson on a Sunday night in July of 1990, watching the clock, watching the driveway, waiting for headlights that never came. She learned it again 31 years later, when she finally got part of what she had been waiting for. And we are left with what we are always left with at the end of cases like this, the inadequacy of justice, the permanence of loss, and the fierce, unquenchable human insistence on knowing the truth even when the truth costs more than anyone should have to pay. Lily Cooper was found. She was alive. She was real. She was not the 4-year-old with the gap-toothed smile and the bouncing blonde curls. She was a woman in her mid-30s who had been told, one ordinary day, that her entire life was built on someone else's crime. A woman who is, right now, somewhere in this world, putting one foot in front of the other through a landscape that most of us will never have to navigate. We hope she is okay. We hope she has the support she needs. We hope that the relationship she is building with Patricia Cooper, slowly, carefully, without a road map, is giving both of them something that 31 years of absence could not. We hope that Clover the rabbit, wherever that little stuffed animal ended up, was not the only piece of home that Lily carried with her into the rest of her life. And we hope that wherever David Cooper is, the man who waved from a porch on a summer afternoon in 1990 and did not know it would be the last time, he somehow knows that his daughter was found. If you have stayed with us through this entire story, through every twist, every dead end, every heartbreaking turn of this case, then you understand why we do what we do here at Cold Case Nightfall. Because these are not just stories. These are real people. Real families. Real lives altered beyond recognition by acts of real evil. And the only way we honor the Lily Coopers of the world, the only way we honor the Patricia Coopers who refuse to stop asking the question, is by refusing to look away. By saying the names out loud. By making sure the darkness does not win by default. So here is what we need from you. Hit that like button right now if this case affected you the way we think it did. Subscribe to Cold Case Nightfall if you are not already with us, because every week we go this deep on cases that deserve this kind of attention. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And drop a comment below, your reaction, your thoughts, your questions, your theories. We read every single one. Because this community is how we keep these cases alive. This community is how we make sure the lights stay on. We are Cold Case Nightfall. We will see you next week. And until then, stay aware, stay safe, and never stop asking the questions that matter.